the live events platform of Bloomberg News. And I'm responsible for the programming that we do at Bloomberg House, which is down the road, Promenade 115. Please drop by if you haven't. And after I met with the Admiral here, who I'll introduce here shortly, on Friday, I thought his insights were profound and important, and so I've now booked him to go to Bloomberg House tomorrow morning so he can share his thoughts there as well. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you all today to talk through, I was saying to the Admiral here, a fairly anodyne title for this session, given where the world seems to be today, leadership and strategy in a changing security landscape. That kind of puts it mildly, a changing security landscape. So it's terrific to be here because Admiral Rob Bauer was the chair of the Military Committee of NATO from June 2021 until January 2025, right before the inauguration of Donald Trump. So therefore, he was NATO's most senior military official. And before that, he was the chief of defense and the commander of the Netherlands Armed Forces. So obviously has many years of experience and deep insight into what NATO is going through right now. He's been doing his best to sort of talk me off the ledge, so we'll see if he can do the same for folks here. Since you left NATO, you published a book. You and your co-author, Eleonora Russell, have published a book called If You Want Peace, Prepare for War, a blueprint for deterrence. And that came out in September, and I recommend that you read that as well.
It's on Amazon.
So when we talked on Thursday, obviously the president's desire for acquiring Greenland had already, was well established by that point. We knew all of that. You told me you didn't think this would be the end of the NATO alliance. But then, on Friday and over the weekend, he's now threatening tariffs on countries if they don't go, particularly the ones who have stationed troops as part of a NATO exercise that was just happening. And he's threatened tariffs on those countries if they don't support his desire to acquire Greenland. In fact, he seems to have interpreted the NATO exercises as a threat against the United States, which I have to say, I did wonder were the troops that countries like the Netherlands sent to these exercises in Greenland, were they meant to show the United States what, do you think? What was the purpose of that NATO exercise, do you think?
They were on reconnaissance, because there's later on an exercise, and they were on reconnaissance to check what the surroundings are, what they can expect during the exercise, and what they need in terms of equipment and clothes and stuff to exercise with.
Right.
That's why they went there. It's 2 people, and they are back home, not because they're afraid, but because the reconnaissance is over.
Right.
So, I think there's 2 things with Greenland. One is the issues at home for President Trump. I think the inflation is such that the people are grumpy to him, that he promised something else than what they have to pay in the shops now. And the second one is Epstein still. So I think those 2 things, he needs distraction from those 2 topics.
Right.
And that's probably the reason why he talks about Greenland the way he talks about it. Because actually he can get what he wants by just asking and talking to allies and discussing it with Greenland and Denmark, of course, the Kingdom of Denmark. And so it's fascinating that the attempt by European leaders to help the US by showing more interest in the Arctic, by sending military personnel for an exercise, was met by these tariffs. And the threat, as described by President Trump, and that I agree with, is Russia and China. And I'll talk about that a little later. So if nations want to help him to counter the threat from Russia and China, and then you tell the European nations you will get tariffs if you do that, then the only ones that will dance around the room is Russia and China. So that is not logic. I was told that the Swedish Prime Minister said something like that he heard that President Trump said at some stage he might have been misinformed. He might have been misinformed about the purpose of those European military sent to Greenland. If that is the case, then that might be an opening to roll back on this tariff discussion. Now, why do I think it is important that we do something about the Arctic? Because I agree with him there. And the US for a long time has neglected the Arctic. It was last year that they bought icebreakers in Finland after having had only 2 very old icebreakers for a very long time. They have deals with Denmark since World War II to operate in and around Greenland, but they actually reduced the number of troops to about 150 in this one base. In one base.
Have many more bases.
And so if there is now a little bit of panic in terms of we need to do more, as I said earlier, I think they can discuss this with the Danish government, and there probably is an agreement fairly soon without having to have and own Greenland. Mm-hmm. Now, the raw materials is another discussion, but if you look at the security issues, we can solve that within NATO. That's actually what the whole alliance is for. And so the reason why he talks about it, the way he talks about it, is probably because of these internal issues at home.
Right. And if he says that the main issue is around the security of the West, and that's why the United States needs to own it, he says that. But of course, he said the reason for toppling the Maduro or arresting Maduro was about drugs. But then, of course, revealed later, actually, it was really more about oil. So, could it be about the minerals?
It could. But there is a security issue as well. I mean, we see, and that's also in a way almost funny, that as a result of climate change, the waters in the Arctic are warming up. He doesn't believe in climate change. But so now the problem that is a result of those warming up waters is that the ice is melting. And as a result of that, these waters in the north become navigable. And that's good news for China, because merchant vessels can use those waters to actually reduce the trip from China to Europe and the United States with 10 days.
Right.
And the volume, 90% of the volume of everything that's being transported around the world is still being transported by at sea, over sea. And so that is an important thing for the Chinese. Now, if merchant vessels can navigate those waters, then of course naval vessels can navigate those waters as well. And if the Russian Pacific Fleet can come to the Atlantic Ocean in a matter of days, then that is a strategic issue to look at. And now the Chinese are teaming up with the Russians in a way that is really concerning. Right. Everybody's talking about the Russians because of Ukraine, but I'm convinced that the real problem is China in the next couple of decades. Right. We are seeing the tectonic plates of power are shifting. This is about rebalancing of power in the world between US and China, not Russia. Russia is a nuclear state and therefore dangerous, but it doesn't have the economy actually to deliver on its ambitions. And those ambitions are the Russian Empire. So we know that. And we have written proof of that because the Russians sent in December 2021 a concept treaty text with NATO to change the relationship. And it was about the buffer zone around Russia again. And so this is about China and the US. And I think what you see if you look at the whole discussion on leaving arms deals, also the US, is because Russia and the US were, in those arms deals, in those arms reduction deals. And China wasn't and isn't. And China is growing its military in a fascinating way, including the nuclear weapons. And so what the US sees is China that is coming up militarily in a completely uncontrolled way by any, whatever deal, and therefore they wanted to get rid of the deals that were on the table with Russia,
Right.
because otherwise you would fight China with your hands on your back. And so that is what we see. It's the harsh reality of geopolitics. It's a raw reality that it is about power again. It's about might. It's not the law that is coming first, but it is your power and your might. And I think especially Europe needs to wake up here, because we want to talk about the world how we would like it to be, not how it actually is at the moment. And I'm not saying I like what I see, but the reality is that it is changing the way it is changing.
Right.
And therefore we have to adjust to that reality, not to how we want it to be. And I think in Europe we have talked about the world for too long how we would like it to be.
Right. Do you think? Let's take a step back. I think you would agree that Trump was right to push NATO countries to increase their defense spending. Right?
Absolutely.
Right.
We actually have to thank him for it.
Right. Right. Poland is actually, one of the countries with one of the strongest militaries, right, within NATO.
You can exaggerate.
Right.
Yeah.
So they've been doing their share. But why do you think it is that some of the other countries, Germany, for example, neglected their defense responsibilities?
Because for too long we had basically free security from the US for 40 years,
Right.
free goods from China, and free oil and gas from Russia. And all three is over. And I think that's the reality Europe is now waking up to. And that's why Europe has to do more than any other continent to change its ways. And then people talk about Europe in a romantic way, as if it is, a united group of people. But it's 30 nations, 27 of which are in the EU. And so it's a geography. It's not a united group of people. And therefore, we have to realize that it is difficult to actually get things done in Europe, because it is those 30 nations that have 30 different governments and different interests. But if we don't organize ourselves differently, then we will become irrelevant.
You're essentially describing, I think, with the rise of China and competition with the U.S., essentially two world orders, two distinct world orders that are developing, right?
Absolutely. So the one world order under the UN, the rules-based order under the UN Charter, and then subsequent treaties and laws, I think will disappear. I think increasingly you already see that the UN Security Council is unable to do anything in Ukraine, because one of the permanent members is part of the problem and doesn't want to be part of the solution. China is supporting Russia in this, whilst saying it's so important that sovereign states and internationally recognized borders should be protected. And they have not condemned the Russian attack once. So China is helping Russia politically, and they say we don't bring any weapons to Russia, but they are keeping Russia in the fight, because actually China provides Russia with all the raw materials and all the components to build the weapons the Russians need. So technically they're right, we're not delivering weapons, but they are allowing Russia to stay in the war. So I think China is a serious, increasingly. China produces 38% of the world's production. So to become independent of China is a dream. It's no longer possible. As President Trump talks about bringing back the automobile industry in the US, it's basically an assembly plant more than a production plant. So all these things mean that we have to respond differently to the things we see. The global rules-based order, I think, is going, and we will have at least two parallel systems where there's different rules, different legal systems, different currencies, and companies now also have to think in which of the systems do I want to operate, do I want to do business, because your IP might not be protected any longer in this other system. And the one system I would say is Europe and North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, maybe Singapore, and some others. And then the other is probably something that looks very familiar to BRICS. And so I think that is what we see happening now. It is difficult for BRICS to organize themselves because it actually isn't a lot. I mean,
Right.
EU and NATO is institutions that have a long-lasting, established organization. But I think that is what the nations, especially China and Russia, want to go to, away from the dollar, the pound, and the euro, and a new set of rules for them.
So when you speak now with CEOs and business leaders, and you talk about the insights from your book, what is your message to businesses? Because in this Western order, as you describe it, we don't have command and control economies. So unlike what China and Russia have, so how does that world order prepare itself for war to maintain peace?
Yeah, so we've had and still in a way, a hyper focus on efficiency. And that is to keep the costs as low as possible in the industry and to keep the spending as low as possible in the governments. And as a result, we have seen that although it has some advantages, over time it has created strategic risks for our effectiveness, actually. So the efficiency discussion has now affected our effectiveness in a very negative way. And what do I mean by that? Is that we see, as a result of efficiency thinking, we have a just-in-time, just-enough economy, which is very smart because you maximize the use of your production capacity. That's what you do. If you order a car, the car dealer can tell in the third quarter you will get your car. So they can plan everything and they can control everything. But we are no longer able to respond to a peak demand signal, as we saw in the pandemic with medical and as we see now in a war with the defense industry. And, the military wins battles, but it's the economy that wins a war. So we have to change our economies. And I'm not saying that we should change our economy to a war economy. That's too far-fetched. But we need to understand that if we're unable to scale up our industries to a point where we are able to produce what we need in a war, and in the book I described this not to fight the war, but actually to prevent a war. That's why the title of the book is If You Want Peace, Prepare for War. Because that is part of deterrence. If the Russians look at us and see that we can do this, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, we can do this. We have everything. We have the money, we have the people, we have the creativity. If we are unable to do this, then who can? And so we can do it, but we need to focus. And we need to focus away from efficiency thinking, from risk-averse thinking, and we need more leadership in terms of explaining to the people why it is necessary. And too many people still think, also in business, that it is a choice. But I believe this choice has been made for us already by the Russians and the Chinese.
Are you seeing a change in mindset as you talk with business leaders? Because that is a fairly dramatic change in the way that people operate their businesses and think about the economy.
If you look at something like the climate change discussion and the sustainability discussion in business. It took about 15 to 20 years for business to actually change their ways. And I think this is also a transformation discussion, much more than a switch. So if I talk to CEOs and business leaders, they understand what the issue is. For example, if you're in a bank and you hear from the defense industry, okay, so I want to get a loan, but the bank doesn't give me the loan because it's against the sustainability goals. Then I go to a CEO of a big bank in the Netherlands and I confront him with that. And he says, okay, Rob, I will go home and I will check. And he phones me a week later and he says, actually, there's nothing in our rules and regulations that prevent us from investing in the defense industry. And then I say, well, dear CEO, the problem is that if someone in a startup comes to your bank and asks for a loan of 5 million euros, it's not you that will do that check. It is a mid-level staffer that will get that on his or her desk. And if that person thinks it's against the sustainability goals, it ends up in the no stack. So this is about a transformation, as we've seen with climate change, and as you see with a lot of difficult things where you have to change the whole organization. Now, I have been going, I did the full circle. I started my career in the Cold War, and I sort of ended it in a time where the Russians were a threat again. But if you leave university and you come in a world, in a society, in a company, in a government, where efficiency thinking is the only thing that counts, that's the holy grail, and accountability, and risk-averse thinking, and after 30, 40 years, people say, we have to do it the other way. It takes time.
Right.
And you can order people around, but if it's what you have learned over 30 years, you can't get rid of in 2 days.
Right.
So this will be a transformation. It will take time. Now, the one good thing about a war, the only probably, is that transformation goes much faster.
Right.
Because everybody sort of understands, it's if you don't do it,
It's a matter
then
of
you
survival.
then you will lose the war. And that's the whole thing. And thinking in terms of effectiveness is the only thing that counts in a war, because it is about winning or losing. President Zelensky will not ask, is it really 3.5 million euros a Patriot missile? He doesn't care. He needs more.
Right.
And so I think that is the sort of thing that you now see, is that the shock is there, but the way we have been brought up, and it is everywhere. It is in ministries of finance. It is in our, the controllers in a company. It's everywhere. People say, no. And so if you want to change that, it will take time.
One of the things I think that President Trump has, again, to your point, correctly identified the problem. Whether he has presented the right solution is another question. But he has found, the United States, to your point, has found that it lacks the industrial capacity to build the number of warships it needs, to create the amount of armaments and missiles that it needs, that we're providing to or selling now to Ukraine, paid for by the Europeans, while still maintaining its own military stocks to prepare for potential conflicts elsewhere. So there is very obviously a problem that you've identified, but does he have the right solutions in mind? Is he contributing to helping change this way of thinking across Western democracies?
Well, the
is he
way
just
he used
disrupting it?
executive orders, for example,
Right.
is fascinating because, don't get me wrong, I'm very much for our democracies, and I think we have neglected our democracies for too long, and we haven't done any maintenance over the last 80 years. We thought it was such a bloody good concept, it didn't need any maintenance. But if you're in a relationship, we all know it takes hard work to maintain a relationship. It's not a given. And so we haven't done that with our democracies, and therefore it's a shock to see that it sometimes doesn't work. And one of the problems, I think, increasingly is that, at least in the Netherlands, but I think it's in many more nations, everybody can say no. Everybody can stop something, whether it is building a road. And then somebody says, yeah, but there is this very special little fox running around there, and we have to prevent it from extinguishment, or how do you say?
Extinction.
Extension.
Yeah.
And so we have to stop the building of the road. And for a long time, I said, yeah, of course, we do that because it's very important. But sometimes things are more important than helping the dying fox. And sometimes you have to think in terms of, okay, is this about the extension of our society? Is this about the extension of our country? Because of the existential threat. And do people want to see the fact that there is a number of existential threats? I've been accused of warmongering many, many times. And then I, point back to the title of the book. It starts with, if you want peace, prepare for war. I don't want to go to war. But I honestly believe if we are well prepared for war, the chance the Russians will do anything against us is much smaller. And so for many years, ministers would tell me when I was in the military, Rob, of course we cannot defend ourselves. We have NATO for that. Now, if 32 nations would say that, what is NATO? NATO is actually nothing. And so Article 3 is about, and that's why it's before Article 5. Everybody knows Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. But Article 3 says you have the obligation, every nation has the obligation, to be able to defend itself. It starts with that. And if everybody is able to defend itself, then helping others, if you're attacked as a collective, then it's much easier. And so for a long time, too many nations, especially in Europe and Canada, by the way, have neglected the ability to defend themselves. And the United States, the people in the United States, not MAGA, it's not Trump, it's not the Republicans, the people in the United States are sick and tired of Europeans and Canadians that are not willing to take their own security seriously. And I think that's what so Trump didn't make this up. It started under Reagan, I think, that discussion.
Right.
But enough is enough. That point had arrived when Trump came in the second time.
So I think we have a microphone here, maybe in the room. If we have questions from the audience, yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned an important point, transformation. I have a provocative question. Russia had played maybe a good role in order to enable us that we go for the transformation. So what do you think about that? So that Putin says, okay, I make the scenario and you have to do something. And frankly speaking, sometimes I have the feeling on the back, let's see what happens between Trump and Putin in Anchorage. Maybe they have made a deal in order to make things happen, that the Europeans especially have to wake up, have to change and have to transform.
There's a lot of stories about whatever deals. I don't want to speculate because I don't know. What I do know is that, and I said it this morning in another panel, I think the Europeans now understand the wake-up call, but they now need to come out of bed. And I think that is the issue here. We are still in bed. And we love to talk about someone else. So we love to talk about Trump. Have you seen what he said? Have you heard what it's amazing. And so, but we don't spend the same time talking about ourselves. Like, you can't change someone else. You can't. You can only change yourself. And therefore, my sort of strong advice to everybody is we should look at ourselves in the mirror and answer the question, have I done everything I promised in the last couple of decades? And if the answer is no, don't talk about somebody else. Start talking about yourself and why you didn't do that. So in a way, I cannot imagine that Putin is doing this on purpose.
No.
Because somebody made this joke. He's our, he got he's our, he got the best prize of supporting NATO. by starting this war because now Finland and Sweden are a member, etc. So he brought us together in a way. And the funny thing with these hybrid attacks, he's also bringing us together. So in a way, I think that's stupid. He should focus on one country and not on all the countries. Because as a result of attacking all these countries, everybody says, shit, have you been attacked by the Russians? Then, okay, let's work together to make sure that that doesn't work in the longer run. So yeah, he brings us together, but we should actually make the next step.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So just a continuation of that, I guess my question is bifold. The first one is, we know historically what the ideas circulating around the European military as one unit look like, but I'm kind of curious where we're at today from that perspective, if you happen to have any insight. And then my second question is more of a imagination exercise and your prediction for NATO, considering the current situation with America.
During media training, I was told and trained not to answer any what-if questions, but let's see where we end up
right now.
So to your second question, I think we should be careful, especially in Europe and in Canada, to not break something that isn't broken. So if people start talking about NATO without the US, I sort of say, why? Why? What are we doing? And be careful what you wish for. I spoke to a Belgian minister 2 years ago, and she said, yeah, I think we should organize ourselves without the US. And I said, ma'am, it's fascinating because you're not willing to pay the 2% now. Do you know how much it will cost without the US to keep safe? That is between 5 and 10%. So if you're not willing to pay 2%, why are you willing to pay between 5 and 10% without the US? What is the logic there? Of course, she didn't have an answer. Now, that's to the... So I think NATO is, and I said it to you earlier, I think NATO is not in a danger here. And we have weathered other storms in NATO over the last 75 years. That's the advantage of being a little bit older. 1966, the French left the military part of NATO, returned in 2009. Everybody thought then it's the end of NATO. We had to move the headquarters from Paris to Brussels. The Turks and the Greek fought each other in 1974 over Cyprus. Didn't end NATO. We thought end of Cold War was the end of NATO. It wasn't. So in many ways, we should actually trust how strong we are. And our unity is our strength, and therefore it is also our Achilles heel, of course, because that's what the Russians are after, to make sure we are no longer united. So that's where we should always focus on. And the fact that we have an issue with the US on Greenland now doesn't mean that's the end of NATO. I think NATO is too important for the US as well to allow it to break up as a result of a military attack on Greenland. Because I agree with Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister from Denmark, if that happens, if there is a military takeover in Greenland by the US, that's the end of NATO. But as a result, I don't think it's going to happen. Because NATO is too important for the US as well. The US needs a stable and secure Arctic. The US needs a stable and secure Atlantic Ocean. And actually, despite everything Vance and anybody is talking about, the US needs a stable and secure Europe. We're their second trading partner, for example. So it's stupid to ruin Europe. It's not in the interest of the US. And then the first question.
Just to follow up, then why do you think there's so much instability as a result of the way they're carrying their international politics nowadays?
Because as I said, I think part of what is happening, and that's the method of how they work, is very different. And it's flooding the zone with shit is basically part of what is happening. So make sure there is so much instability every day that nobody knows what is next. And therefore it is so important that everybody actually keeps the eye on the ball. Don't look at every piece of red meat he throws into the arena. Don't. Because actually something else is happening. So I think that is very important, that all the professionals in the world, whether it's diplomats or the military or ministers and politicians, keep the eye on the ball. What is really important? What is the US actually trying to achieve? Don't look at this. This is noise. This is something else.
Sure.
Thank you.
questions, and since our panel is about leadership and strategy, you said the US doesn't tolerate anymore the outsourcing of European security to the United States. How would you define the strategy, and who can play the leadership role to build European deterrence capabilities? That's the first question. And the second, in your opinion, what's the chance for the peace deal or some form of a truce in Ukraine in 2026?
Okay. It is basically a little bit connected to your first question, which is the European army. It's not going to happen because there is no NATO army either. There's nations that have armed forces. That's the way we have structured ourselves. The nation state is still, the way we have organized ourselves. And as long as that is the case, and we're not a federal Europe, for example, then it's nations with their governments that decide on how to use their armed forces, whether it's for NATO or EU or UN or for themselves. Now, the good news is in The Hague, we agreed on the capability targets, which is basically the shopping list for all the nations, what to buy in the next 10 to 15 years, not in terms of which type of equipment, but in terms of the type of weapons that can achieve certain effects. So it can be a drone or a tank, that doesn't matter. And so that has been agreed by all the nations, including Spain, by the way. But only Spain thinks it's cheaper that it doesn't cost 3.5%. But they have agreed to the capability target. So everybody knows now what they have to buy. Now the good news in The Hague is that we have agreed actually, and it's a very important decision, not only to the capability targets, but it was like this: US contribution to NATO, Canadian, European contribution to NATO. In The Hague, the decision was to make it like this: that the US on the one hand and the Europeans and Canada on the other hand are contributing evenly to NATO. If that is happening, then as an alliance, as a whole, we become much stronger. And the European nations become stronger because they then have bought capabilities that until now only the US has. So the discussion on let's do something else in the EU next to NATO is a, pardon my French, bullshit discussion. Why? Because we have agreed in NATO to do that. We have agreed in NATO to become more capable with the European nations, European armed forces. So if we do what we have agreed, the mirror discussion, then actually we are helping ourselves, we are helping to keep the Americans close to us. And as a result, because we are more able, more capable, we therefore can play the role that the US basically expects more and more from us. They will provide the nuclear deterrence, and we can provide our own conventional deterrence. And so that is one. Now, who is the leader in Europe? It's a fascinating question. And by the way, 96% of the Europeans, people that live in EU, are protected by NATO. 96%. The bill is paid, 80% of the bill in NATO is, until very recently, is paid by non-EU members of NATO. So Europe is not in a strong position to argue with that. If you talk about the security discussion, stay with NATO. That's the only solution. And for economics and things like that, that's EU. The EU should play a role in growing the defense industry, for example, in Europe. That's true. Now, who's the leader in Europe? The French president wants to be the leader in Europe, but then all the other nations do not want him to be the leader in Europe. The Germans didn't have an opinion for a long time. Slowly with Merz it's changing. And actually it was the Polish prime minister that said, this is the first time that we are not afraid of a strong Germany. So this is the strongest economy in Europe. They should also take a leadership role politically when it comes to security. And if you look at the German budget for the next couple of years, it's more than 100 billion euros compared to UK and France, 50, 60 billion. So that's huge. Now, so the Germans will need to have an opinion, and the good thing in NATO is whether we are grumpy often about the Americans, but the good thing in NATO is there is a leader, which is the US. And it actually makes things possible. Because if everybody is the leader or nobody is the leader, then what do you have? And that's the problem in the EU. There is no leader. So we will have to agree to common goals to strengthen our defense, to strengthen our response to international things that are happening, like now with Greenland. As Europeans, we need to have an opinion. If we want to play a role in the bigger world, we will need to have an opinion and need to be able to stand behind that. And actually, not only by talk, but also by force if necessary, because that's the reality of this world. And the second question was
Ukraine.
Ukraine.
Right.
It's fascinating that it surfaces time and time again that President Putin wants a deal and President Zelensky doesn't want a deal. That's what last week Trump said it again. I'm convinced Putin doesn't want a deal for 3 reasons. One, he hasn't achieved any of his strategic goals. He doesn't even have the Donbass as a minimum. So that's one. Second, his economy is a war economy. He's successful there, absolutely. He's producing more now than he needs in the war. So he's reconstituting his armed forces as we speak. And that reduces the time that we have to get our act together. All the military plans are there. We basically know what we want, and we have the money available. But now we go into the shop and the shelves are empty in all the industries. So we need to ramp up our industrial capacity. But his economy is a war economy. So if the war is over today, he has an empty economy. He has a huge problem then. If he suddenly is no longer able to focus on the war with that economy. And thirdly, there's more than 700,000 soldiers in occupied Ukraine, Russian soldiers. They're traumatized. Many of them are sort of wounded and have to continue to fight. There's a lot of them killed. We're talking about more than 1 million Russian soldiers killed and seriously wounded in this war. And if those people return to Russia after the war, his idea was, of course, to keep them in Ukraine because Ukraine was his. But that's not going to happen. So they will return home and they will cause a lot of problems in Russia. As the returning soldiers from the Afghanistan war were the cause of the criminal spikes in Russia after they returned. So those are the 3 reasons why Putin doesn't have any incentives to finish this war, I'm afraid.
So
if we're not forcing him,
right,
and the US is the only one that can do that,
right,
maybe together with China, but if that's not happening, then unfortunately I'm afraid the war will continue in 2026. Right. And by the way, on 25 February 2026, the war in Ukraine lasts longer than the First World War.
Right. Right. And meanwhile, we're all distracted by Greenland and tariffs.
Keep your eye on the ball.
Right. But to your point, it's only the United States that could really force something with Putin, and this president seems disinclined to do that.
Well, I don't know. People says he has a deal with Putin. I think he is very much looking at America first in everything he does. I don't think it's pro-Putin. I think it's pro-America. So the deals he wants to make with Putin is also about, making sure. And I've been in conferences where a lot of business people and people in banking sort of talk about the war as a nuisance. It should stop. And then they say, yeah, all this killing, it's terrible. But the real thing they're interested in is to be able to continue business after the war has stopped. And that is a bit cynical if you look at why this war is fought. And for me, it's in a way unacceptable that Putin can walk away from this war as a winner. But It might, to a certain extent.
Right. I think we have time for maybe one.
There's one in the back.
Yeah. Well, I promised him first, and then you. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Vitaly from company Destinus. We are the largest European drone producer. And first of all, Rob, thank you so much for speaking very frank, very direct. I believe this is what needed. And as such, you brought a very beautiful metaphor. We are awaking, or we are awake, but we are
It's still in
sleeping
bed.
back. And we know it from our life, and that's why I love your metaphor. It takes much effort to get out of bed, particularly if you don't want to get out of bed. So what does it take for Europe to get out of the bed? Because we have a longest war since almost a century in Europe, and this did not help. We have desires and plans to shop, but the shelves are empty. Beautiful. We have people like us, the industry, who wants to produce and supply and develops the drones or capabilities, but you will not build a plant and invest 100, 200 million euros until the government gives you the contracts for 10 years. And the government is reluctant because they think the war is over, now back to usual. So what does it take from your point of view to government and governments, as they are very divided, as you laid out today beautifully? What does it take? Another war? What does it take European leaders to make this final step to get out of that? Thank you.
As I said earlier, the one good thing about a war is that it helps to focus tremendously. So a war changes things overnight. Now, I really hope we're not going to wait for that. But sometimes I have the feeling that we need that to get the real shock and to get all these people out of bed. Because for too many people, it is still a choice. For too many people say, nah, well, the tanks are not driving in the streets of, Amsterdam or Warsaw or Madrid or Barcelona or Lisbon or Berlin. Say, no. But if there is an attack on Estonia, we are at war, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we agreed. That's the promise we made. And by the way, at that moment, Rotterdam is a legitimate military target for the Russians, because that's where the reinforcements come through, partly. We will see hybrid attacks in a way we haven't seen yet. There's power outages going to be that leads to no mobile phone anymore, no money, no gas, total chaos. So we are at war then. So don't think it will be a distant thing for the Estonians. It is for us as well. And so now everybody I talk to sort of looks at me like, yeah, shit, he is right. But it will not happen. And to them I say, when the full-fledged war in Ukraine started on 24 February, we followed the intelligence in NATO headquarters for 4.5 months. We knew everything. And not only me, all the government leaders, all the ministers of defense, all the chiefs of defense, minister of foreign affairs, they knew. All the government people that needed to know knew the intelligence. And we knew there was 190,000 Russians around Ukraine, in Russia and in Belarus. We knew the number of vehicles, we knew the number of ammunition they brought. We saw the hospitals come, and we saw the blood come. And when the blood came, I knew this is serious, because blood only, stays usable for a week or 10 days. So I thought, shit, this is really going to happen. And still there were more than 10 nations in the alliance that politically said, yeah, we see all that, but we cannot believe he's going to do it. He's not stupid. He's not stupid. Why did people say that? Because for a very long time we believed that if you are economically connected to each other, and you have mutual economic interests in each other's nations, you're stupid if you go to war, because it hurts your economy. That's what we believed. So by working together with the Russians, economically as well, we bought their gas and oil, we thought we were safe. Maybe we thought, we wanted to believe we were safe. And so that was proven wrong. It was proven wrong in Georgia in 2008. It was proven wrong in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. It was proven wrong in 2022 with a full-fledged invasion in Ukraine. And the other sort of assumption was that if you make the Chinese rich, they will become democratic. Both assumptions are proven wrong. And as a result, and I now hear what I heard about Russia for 20 years, like, no, you can't talk too badly about them because we need their oil and gas. I now hear it about China. No, you can't talk too badly about it because we need their, and then whatever comes. But the reality is those nations, those leaders are willing to go to war even if it hurts their economy. Now, I think the Russian people are able to suffer more than the Chinese people. I think the Chinese people are less inclined to suffer for their leaders, the Russians are, because the Russians have good training since Genghis Khan. Basically, they were under terrible leaders that made them suffer. And I think the Chinese people are, as long as the Chinese people economically are sort of okay, Xi is okay, whatever he does abroad. That's the difference between China and Russia. Therefore, I'm inclined to think that China is willing to stay on the peace road longer than Russia. But we have to understand it is not our way of thinking that counts, but it is their way of thinking that counts. And I think the Polish people understood this much earlier than a lot of us. And we all said to the Poles, you were Russophobia, when they warned us. But they were right. And so if you try to understand the Russians and Putin, then he will not give up. His people will not force him to give up because he owns the information space in Russia. He doesn't send a lot of soldiers from Moscow or St. Petersburg to the war. It's from the poorer regions. And so everything you hear in Russia is what Putin tells the Russians. And the internet in Russia is cut off from the World Wide Web. You need a VPN connection, and the number of people that is allowed to have VPN connection is limited. So he owns the space, and I think what we need is, and that's what I'm trying to do with all these public speaking engagements, is to convince people they have to get out of bed. And I'm pretty sure I'm successful in the sense that every time I speak to 50, 100, 200, 300 people, they go home, and I have this dream that they go home and they tell all their friends and their business partners, and so that it's sort of spreading. But it's not, because tomorrow morning a number of you will have other problems. And you have to look at the first quarter numbers on your company, and there's you have to hire someone else because, so there's a new problem. And is there war? No, it's actually the weather is sort of okay. You can still have gas and electricity and
Yeah. Okay, last question at this gentleman.
Good afternoon, Admiral. I'm one of the people in the Bloomberg radio book, series Parties Admiral. I have a question. Have you changed in the meanwhile, since the book was published, have you in the meanwhile changed your opinion on draft, or your opinions on draft actually, and what do you see in the European space in that regard?
Thanks for reading the book. Actually, no. So when we published the book in June, it was published in June.
June?
I think it came on Amazon in September.
Okay.
But the book was published in the Netherlands and Belgium in June, and in Germany in July. Germany, actually, you can buy it in Switzerland. There's a German version as well. Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, there's a German version. So when we published the book in June, after half a year of Trump, we sort of thought, should we change the book before it is published? Is it sort of Trump-proof? And we really believe that the 7 lessons that are in are still valid. And I still believe that they are valid. It's probably not the only thing you need to do. So it's not a complete story. But I think it's about effectiveness versus efficiency thinking. It's about the ability to take risk again. It's about leadership. So there's a number of things that I think are still apply, whatever happened since then. It's fascinating. The book will be published in Ukraine in I think April or May. So we are now on request of the publishing house in Ukraine, and we give everything that we earn in Ukraine to a charity on the book that we give to a charity that's called Children of Heroes. It's a fascinating and fantastic charity that looks after by now 15,000 children that are half orphan or orphan as a result of the war. And so, but the publisher said, can you do a new preface for Ukraine? So we had to write that. So we're in the process of doing that. And of course, in that sense, there is some things that are very actual on Ukraine. But the courage hasn't changed. If you look at the amount of territory that the Russians have gained since 2024 is actually minimal versus the amount of people that died and got wounded as a result. He still doesn't have the Donbas, still doesn't. He says he has Pokrovsk just before these talks with the peace talks, and then of course to influence everybody, but it's still not the case. So it's amazing what the Ukrainians have achieved, and for me it's an additional proof of the importance of resilience. I mean, the Ukrainians have become more resilient as a result of the war period between 2014 and 2022. I think the Ukrainians were naive, as we are still in 2014 when the Crimea was annexed. But the time in between that annexation and the full-fledged war, they have become much less naive. People started to understand the importance of defending your own country. People started to understand the importance of a whole of society approach, what resilience means. So I speak to an industrial leader in Ukraine that builds guns. And I said, how many guns do you produce? He said 36 a month to 16 in Germany per year. Now the German guns are more sophisticated than the Ukrainian guns, but still it's a huge difference. And he said, I take 240 hours out of an employee every month, which is 20 days, 12 hours a day. Now, if we're lucky in Europe, it's 160. But at average, I think it's closer to 130, 128. So we have come to a point also in Europe where we have to understand that part of our problems can be solved by starting to work harder. We are the champions part-time working in Europe. And people see that as a right. But if it is about your security and the survival of your nation, I mean, those people that work 240 hours in Ukraine do that because there's a lot of people at the front or a lot of people have died. And there's less people for the industry and less people in the government at large because of that military that has grown. So there's no discussion about this. But I don't think there's a discussion about part-time working in Ukraine at the moment.
All right. Thank you very much, Admiral, for this conversation. Thank you to the Polish Business Hub for hosting us. And have a good afternoon.